I believe that cities are good for us. I think there is something within them, something within that sort of 7,000-year history, which really does change who we are and the way that we are together. There is something about cities that makes us richer, more productive in our work. It can make us fitter. It can make us more creative. It might even make us happier. And that in itself is in some ways a controversial and a complicated sort of idea, but I think it's still worth raising. And so going to those big numbers, as Jeremy was saying, in 2007 we became 50% urban. This is going to grow, so that by 2050 it will be 75% urban, and probably by the end of this century will be almost 99.9% urban. This means that every single day 180,000 people are arriving somewhere in the world at the door of the city. There are 180,000 people every day who want to become citizens. Every single moment, there are about 40 million Chinese people moving between the village and the city. So what does this all mean? There are two other, I think, very useful statistics that come from exactly the same year in 2007. The first, that within the core cities, by this time, about 70% of all citizens, or all people who lived in these core cities, had smartphones. They had these extraordinary mobile computing devices in their pocket. At the same time, in 2008, over 8 billion things were connected to the Internet of Things. That's more than there are people in the world. Now it's up to 10 billion things connected to the Internet of Things, and soon it will be up to 60 billion things. This will soon create a market that is worth over $1 trillion, and this will be one of the things that will profoundly affect the way that we interact, the way that we live, and the way that we work together in the future. And so at this point, at these three event horizons, we need to ask, who is the city for? What are the rules of coming together? And what might be the rubric, the way that we become citizens? Because in many of the places that I go, and in many of the people that I talk to, and in many of the books that have come out about cities, so often they look at the economics of the city. And they also look at the impact that technology might have. And also there is a very rich discussion to be had about the impact of design and how that will also, the fabric of the city, will change the life and the places that we live in. There is less discussion about the civics of what it is to be a citizen, of what it is to connect you and me, us all together, the whole city in one place, and then within cities. This is something that is put to one side far too often. And it's this which I called a social urbanism that we have to put at the heart of this conversation about the future of the city. It is going to be about all these things, and you can't divorce economics or placemaking or technology from the idea of citizenship. But we need to think about it people first. And I believe this because I believe that we are simply connected, that we are hardwired to be together. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. The famous Danish architect Jan Gehl in the 1960s, one of his first schemes was this place in the center of Copenhagen called Strøget, which was essentially just pedestrianizing the center of the city. The reaction when he first started setting out this plot was in some ways abrasive. Many of the people sort of said, we're Danish, we're not Italians, and we don't sit around drinking cappuccinos in piazzas. But within a matter of months, people were coming here, and this place was becoming a vital part of the city. So Jan Gehl didn't quite know why this was happening, so he wanted to really go and look and observe what people were doing. And he went and he watched the way that people used to interweave and connect on this ordinary space. And what he discovered is that people would go and look at, see what was at the cinema, or go window shopping, or just go and meet friends. The important things that people were doing was firstly watching sort of street entertainers, secondly meeting their friends, and then thirdly, actually watching a building site. And what he concluded was that people are interested in people. In many ways, it's that simple. If you create a place where people are, more people will come. But there's something extra that happens here when these people come together, and this is something that, using another example, the great American writer Jane Jacobs talks about in her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. This, in some ways, is the Bible of this new urbanist movement, and it comes down to this simple observation. She lived on 555 Hudson Street in Greenwich Village in Manhattan, and this was a fairly run-down area of the city. And she would stand outside her doorstep and watch the street as it went about its ordinary day, starting off with the hardware store owner opening up his store, and then the children going to school, and then just the daily churn of life. And she saw something that was special here. She saw that this interweaving of ordinary lives on an ordinary street on an ordinary day created something that was more than the sum of its parts, that there was some electricity that occurred here that you couldn't necessarily engineer, that it came about naturally through the complexity of an ordinary urban street. Now, there have been a number of studies that have worked on this idea of what this interaction could be. So there is the theoretical physicist, a man called Geoffrey West, who came from Cambridge and now works at the Santa Fe Institute. And he is fascinated in complexity theory and also in metabolism. And so he created this vast data set where he put in every piece of information he could about the city. And he discovered that as cities grow, and as the connection of people within the cities grow, surprisingly they become richer and more productive, but also they can become more sustainable and more creative. Another, and I think it's a more local example, which I think is really very, very important, which was done by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation a couple of years ago, took 3 different parts of the UK. The first was a marketplace in Newham, which is one of the more deprived boroughs in the east of London. The second was Cambourne in Cambridgeshire, and the third was a collection of villages in Wiltshire. And what they wanted to do was, in some ways, try and measure, if they could, or observe at least, levels of civility and politeness. And what they discovered, despite the diversity and in many ways the problems that a place like Newham has on a day-to-day basis, it was in this marketplace where one saw the highest levels of politeness. And this really goes to prove that being together and being in places like the city, it's here where we learn to be and here where we learn those rules of citizenship. There's nowhere else we can do it. So we need to think about cities in terms of their public spaces. You know, these are the places where the real genius of the metropolis occurs. And one of the crises of the contemporary city is the compromise of these public spaces. Everywhere we look, particularly in a place which is becoming increasingly congested and increasingly sort of privatized like London, these public spaces are becoming squeezed. And the promise that comes with great public spaces is being reduced. We see this on a number of different levels. It's these places where we can no longer protest, where our voice can never be heard. It is these places where we cannot come together without being watched by CCTV cameras. These places are becoming commercialized, so only certain people are allowed to be there. It is changing the relationship between the owner and, as it were, the renter. These public spaces are becoming privatized, so it's being moved on by people in high-vis vests. And so I want to propose a sort of sense of a social urbanism, one that redefines the value of these public spaces, because this is where we will be able to grow the city, and a good city. I would propose a sort of set of, let's call them values, if you like, for what a good urban space might be. The first is trust. And this is a civic value that we just don't talk enough about. And it is only in these places where we can learn and come to trust each other. But trust is a process. It's not something that you can just pick up. It's something that we have to learn. It's a language that we need to have the confidence in order to be able to share. The second is equality. Equality is the thing that really, inequality is one of the things that really undermines trust. And we're becoming increasingly unequal. If you consider that London is now, the top 10% is 300 times richer than the bottom 10%. This inequality is not just affecting the economy, but it also affects the space of the city. The city is dividing up. There are no-go areas. There are places where the poor are stuck. There are places where the rich have cut themselves off from the rest of the city. It stops the flow. It stops the language and that gathering of trust that's so essential. And so the right of the city, the right to access the city, I think is absolutely paramount and in many ways the third civic value. So we have to consider how we either build or preserve these great public spaces. As I said, it is a process. It's important to consider where the money comes from. Does it come from business? Does it come from the state? I think one of the really interesting things that I think is starting to emerge is an argument about crowdsourcing for large public works. I think it would be really interesting over the next few years what kind of thing that we can crowdsource. In Brooklyn, there is a new swimming pool that is just being crowdsourced, just in the Hudson River. But would we ever be able to crowdsource something like Crossrail? When we consider about what we need to design, we need to think of it about being open-ended, about allowing the people who are going to use this space to make it their own. That it can't be so clean and so finished that they don't feel that this is their place. So how do you create, as a designer, as an architect, an open-ended building that at that moment you give over to the people who actually get to use this place? And the third, I think, which is going to be incredibly important, is the increasingly quantification of the city, the way that we measure or observe the city. Because the more that we measure and observe the city, we have to be careful that we're not doing this just because then we can price things. You know, there is a problem that comes with collection of raw data in order just to give it a value and to give it a value that can then be traded. So we have to be sure what we are collecting data and how we're going to use it. The city is obviously full of problems, but the city is its own solution. There's a wonderful thing that occurs every Saturday in Utrecht, which is a tiny city in Holland, that on every Saturday around 3 o'clock, they carve a letter onto a stone. And this letter is then placed into this long line along the street, which since June 2012 has created a poem. And one hopes that this poem will go on forever, and that it's created by the people who live there and who cherish those places.